All right, so this is, I'm reading this, but I'm not going to read it from there. I'm going to read it from here. Get it? This is Stacy Young, and he asked if you could, if you can move up a little bit closer so you can see his presentation. That would be great. But Stacy is author of Bullies. They're in your office too. Could you be one? He graduated from the American and the George Washington Universities in Washington, D.C. His Bachelor of Science in Business Administration, degree in International Business with a marketing concentration. Master of Business Administration in Finance and Investments with a Human Resources concentration. And a Master of Science in Project Management. His professional career includes approximately 15 years with Fortune 500 companies. He's also taught a variety of college business courses, business communication, introduction to business, marketing, organizational development, and others for the past 5 years. He is an author, blogger, professor, and founder of an educational nonprofit saving our communities at risk through educational services. Some of you might have seen Socrates. It's coming more around anymore. The topics of his other books are about overcoming challenges and inspirational quotes. His next book on business ethics will be available in spring 2014. You can go to his website. I actually went out there. It was pretty nice, actually.
Thank you.
Without further ado, Mr. Stacy Young.
All right, well, thank you. I'm glad you folks can make it tonight. It's a little bit rainy weather out there, so thank you for coming. I will try not to keep you too long. I think the topic that we're going to discuss tonight is something that I think a lot of folks deal with, but don't necessarily know how to deal with it. So we're going to talk about that just a little bit. I'm glad that Terry contacted me to come out and have an opportunity to discuss this subject. So I guess, you know, just sort of by show of hands, how many of you thought that bullying stopped once you left high school, right? Who actually thought that bullying would actually occur in the workplace? Probably not. But how many of you have either witnessed or experienced bullying? Yeah. And how does it make you feel? Not so good. And one of the real challenges is, and when we deal with bullying, specifically in the workplace, it can be a lot more challenging. So when you're at school, it's one thing. When you're at work and you have a family to take care of, you want your bills to be paid, you might be willing to handle or deal with a lot more than you otherwise would tolerate. And then if you don't have a supportive management team or there aren't policies or procedures that are in place, it can be very, very challenging to deal with workplace bullying. There's a lot of discussions in the media today about workplace bullying, and maybe in some ways the term bullying has been thrown around a little bit more widely and associated with a lot of things. But what we're going to talk about is workplace bullying and how it might affect successful projects. So, excuse me. So how many of you believe that workplace bullying is an effective management tool? Is bullying an effective management tool? Unfortunately, some folks think that it is. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Let me just make sure this is going okay. So impact of workplace bullying on successful project delivery. So during this session, we're going to discuss the challenges of working on a project with a workplace bully, the impact that bullying can have on successful project delivery, and the methods to minimize bullying behavior. So let's start with some questions or some statements for consideration. So how many of you have ever heard any of these comments? Bullying doesn't happen in the workplace. If someone bullied you, it's your fault. If you didn't like the things the individual said or did, you should have said or done something. Or, I've never seen anyone bullied at work. Doesn't exist, not even an issue. You know, it's amazing that a lot of times individuals will believe that something's not an issue until what? It happens to them. Exactly. All right, so if we take this a step further, so we look at the comments that we saw in the previous slide, on the left-hand side, and then we look at the evaluation. So when someone says bullying doesn't happen at work, that's their commentary about whether it exists or not. So it's their opinion about it. If someone said, if you were bullied, it's your fault, well, all of a sudden now I'm the victim. So I had control over somebody else's actions when they made a decision to bully me. For the other one, if you didn't like the things the individual said or did, you should have said or done something, well, it's your fault. You're the one that caused it. And then, I've never seen anyone bullied at work. Well, that's someone's opinion about workplace bullying also. So, what do workplace bullies like? What I like to say is that bullies like to, bullies like to hit and they like to pick. And the hit part is sort of appropriate because when we think about schoolyard bullies, a lot of times it was hitting and picking and pulling hair and all those other things. But specifically to workplace bullying, we're going to talk about hit and pick and what those mean. I got to learn how to use my little clicker here. All right. So the reality about bullying is that bullying is about the bully's need for power, influence, and control. So that's the pick. What are the tools that bullies use? They harass, they intimidate, and they threaten. So that's why bullies like to hit and pick. So what things do bullies use in terms of how they get the things done that they want? How do they use their bullying behavior? Well, they can use their power. When someone has power over you, that can be a very daunting task if you're reporting to that individual. One of the things that I always like to tell my students when I'm in my management classes is that just because someone has the power doesn't mean that you should use it. Power should only be used when you have to, because there's a lot of ways that we can deal with it. I'm not going to go through all of them, but their influence. Sometimes bullies have considerable influence within the organization. So they can use their influence, which sort of ties into their connections and networking. A little subtle difference, but when you have connections or you can network with someone else to get the things done that you want, that can also work. A lot of times folks will use their pay grade, which can be tied into their influence and power in the organization. What about intelligence? Have you ever seen anybody bully someone because they have a certain knowledge? Yeah, that happens also. A lot of times folks don't think about it. And I think a lot of times what happens is individuals don't think that bullying is a wide spectrum. So a lot of times we think it's just calling somebody a name or being tough. And being tough, being a tough manager doesn't necessarily mean that you're a bully. It's in the manner in which it's handled. So bullying actually has a large spectrum. So education, sometimes folks think that they're elitist because they have a certain education level or they went to a certain school. They can use information that they possess, relationships, or just their personalities. And there's a lot of other things. So what are some of the types of bullying behavior? Obviously that's a pretty big list, right? The one that individuals probably can associate with the quickest is the one in the upper left. Aggressive and dominant behavior. That's probably the one that you think about the most. Or maybe demeaning behavior, intimidation, manipulative, positional. And those are probably some of the bigger ones, but let's talk about some of the other ones. Embarrassment in terms of a bullying strategy. How many of you have ever seen anyone that's been embarrassed or tried to use embarrassment as a bullying strategy? Why are you opening your mouth? Nobody asked you a question. Have you ever heard something like that? Yeah, and I've seen it from executives where they've slammed their fists on the table. It's like, well, if I want your opinion, I'll ask for it. That's not a motivational strategy for the person that's receiving or for the others that are in the room. It can become very uncomfortable. What about a bullying done by someone who's an extender? You ever think about that one? So, have you ever seen a bullying incident happen? And then someone else who might not have even been involved with the bullying incident gets involved with it, and they can extend it by knowing that they have knowledge about something else, and then they use it to get what they want also, or they can use that information against you. So sometimes the bullying situation is extended as well. And Physical, bullying can be physical as well. Unfortunately, sometimes folks do put their hands on you at work, or they use their stature to try to intimidate you. So we have to be mindful of those. Quid pro quo, if you do this, I'll do this. And that can be used a lot of times. And a lot of times, quid pro quo is typically associated with like sexual harassment. But it happens in other areas as well. So I think that's a pretty good rundown of the list, and there's a few others there. So let's just look at a few bullying statistics. So according to the Society for Human Resource Management, 51% of workers experience incidents of workplace bullying. That's a sizable number, 51%. And it's shocking that more organizations aren't doing more to address it when there's numbers such as that. 44% do not have workplace bullying policies. So 44% of companies don't have workplace bullying policies. Some companies will have anti-harassment or harassment policies, but they don't always specifically deal with workplace bullying. Because a lot of times what folks will say, well, your manager's just being a little tough on you, it's that tough love, you just need to toughen up a little bit. But sometimes it's a lot worse than that. 22% do not have a grievance process to investigate bullying allegations. Saying that things are uncomfortable at work is one thing. So if you say that you're being sexually harassed, folks typically get on it really quickly. But if there's an incident reported of bullying, again, it's about toughening up, maybe you misunderstood. So companies don't necessarily take it seriously. And then 57% do not conduct regular bully prevention or awareness training. So a lot of times we talk about harassment in the workplace, but we don't specifically talk about what is bullying, what are some of the symptoms of bullying, what are some of the effects of bullying, and how can you manage against a situation when you're actually being bullied. And if you have any questions throughout, you can feel free to jump in. It's not a formal presentation. I like to answer questions. So what are some reasons for bullying behavior? So sometimes individuals will bully because there's an abuse of power. So they have a certain level of power in the organization and they use it against others. Disrespect. Sometimes individuals will use bullying behavior just to disrespect someone. Fun. That seems a little silly, but sometimes folks get a kick out of it, knowing that they have a certain level of power over you, or that they can control or intimidate, so intimidation going into the other one. Sometimes individuals have a need for power, because if I'm bullying you, it allows me to feel greater than you, it allows me to have a certain level of control and influence over you. Lack of training. Sometimes bullies just don't know that they're a bully. Can you believe that? How does someone not know that they're a bully? But it happens. Sometimes we just don't know. We've been raised in an environment, maybe the environment that we came from was, the structure was different, maybe in the organization that we're in, that behavior is allowed. And guess what? Probably no one's ever stood up and said, you know what, I'm sorry, I have a problem with the way that you're speaking to me. It's not acceptable. Wanting respect. Some bullies believe that if I treat you aggressively and I demean you, it's my way of getting respect. And bullying, intimidation, harassments, or threats is never a great tool to get respect. Retaliation, sometimes individuals are retaliated against because they report something that's gone on in the organization or file a complaint against the manager. And that's probably one of the biggest things that companies and individuals need to look out for. Individuals need to make sure that they're not being retaliated against, and if they are being retaliated against, then what they need to do is make sure that they report it as soon as something starts to occur. But also companies need to make sure that they have protective policies in place. And we'll talk a little bit about that on the latter in the presentation. And then sometimes bullies just have a feeling of superiority. And again, this is just a sampling of some of the things that bullies do. So what are some common questions about bullying? So is it a workplace bullying? Is it bad management? Or is it bad manners? Well, the answer is yes, yes, and yes, potentially. So bullying, management, and manners don't have to be mutually exclusive. So for consideration, bullying can be an intentional or unintentional act. Do you agree with that? Yeah, because sometimes bullies don't understand that what they're doing is bullying behavior. So when it's intentional, what happens is the individual is directing their behavior towards you or their actions towards you. They mean to do what they're doing, right? And then unintentional, the individual doesn't necessarily mean to do it, it just sort of happens. Some folks just weren't taught that you don't talk to someone in a derogatory way. You don't say, well, why did you say that? That's a stupid idea. But maybe on a one-time occasion, that might not be bothersome. But if someone's doing that to you every time you open your mouth in a meeting, then what does that become? A pattern of behavior. And then that's where it needs to be addressed. So nevertheless, a singular event, intentional or not, can still be a bullying incident.
At what point is it not bullying, just bad management?
Well, you have to...
Or would bad management repetitively become bullying?
Well, so first we need to start with the action or the behavior. So you can have a manager that is doing something, and then so you have to assess the action or behavior. So if it's a one-time event, they just could have had a bad day. That could have just been a situation. But if there's a pattern of repetitive events and the behavior isn't changing, then it moves from just being bad management to being potentially bad manners or being bully. But when someone is intentionally being abusive to someone, demeaning, threatening, then that's when it moves more towards workplace bullying.
Well, I think the demeaning and the threatening is more over the line. I'm just looking at someone whose motivation is different, and just the style that they've observed from others that they try to emulate unsuccessfully.
Yeah.
Could obviously be perceived as someone being bullying, but he's not being a bully because he doesn't know he's being a bully. It's just his way of getting things. It's been successful.
Right. So what is the question in that?
It's just a statement that I'm just not sure that all bullying, if it's unintentional, is truly bullying. It would be more to the specifics and the mannerisms.
Yeah, but just because someone does something and it's unintentional doesn't not make it bullying. Because if I'm doing something and then there's a pattern of behavior, then it can be an issue. But it starts with the individual. So if I'm doing something to you and you don't like it, but you never tell me that what I'm doing is not acceptable to you, how am I ever going to know that what I'm doing is not acceptable, right? So it starts with the individual, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. So the individual has to say, so let's do a little role play. So we've had a situation, something happened at this meeting, something happened in the meeting before that, and I've just said, you know what, Chris, I'm just tired of it. So I say, hey Chris, would you mind if we have a conversation? And I say, hey Chris, I just want to let you know that, in the last couple of meetings, whenever I made a comment, you made derogatory remarks about the things that I'm doing, or you tried to belittle the things that I was working on in comparison to yours. I really don't find that behavior acceptable. So I really would appreciate if you would not do that. And if you have an issue with my work or any of the comments that I make, if it's not directly related to the meeting and it's an evaluation of my behavior or my work, then maybe we can have a conversation outside of the meeting instead of you putting me on display. But generally speaking, if you don't have anything positive or constructive feedback to provide me, I'd rather you not make those comments to me. And at least at that point, I'm engaging the bully and letting them know that their behavior is not acceptable.
And then if that continued, then it would be bullying.
Yeah, because it has to, each individual has to be responsible for letting someone else know that you are exceeding acceptable standards of behavior as it relates to me. And the challenge is that each of us has different standards of behavior and what's acceptable. So as an individual, you have to let someone know that what you're doing I find unacceptable. And until you do that, how is anyone ever going to know that their behavior is not acceptable or potentially bullying behavior because there's a pattern of behavior? Good?
Good.
Just want to make sure I didn't. All right, so what's the difference between these? So a bully usually makes the decisions to intimidate, belittle, harass, or other unwarranted behavior, what I described earlier. A bad manager may not have good management skills, but might require some additional training. So sometimes you have a bad manager that might be a bully. They just need some training because they don't know any better. No one's ever told them that what they were doing is wrong. Or it could just be bad manners, which just could be actions or behaviors that are not intended to be harmful. However, the individual doesn't behave or intend to behave inappropriately. So, evaluating questionable behavior. So, this goes back to the point that you were making. So, what are some ways to evaluate questionable behavior? Well, the first thing we need to do is consider the context. Just because someone says something every time someone says something, each of us evaluates what's being said. So you need to consider the context of what's being said. But in addition to considering the context, we also need to determine the intent. So, you know, I've been working with Bill for a long time. I've never had any issues, but today he just said something to me that was a little strange. Well, there probably wasn't an intent because we've had that relationship, right? So I need to determine what the intent is. Because sometimes when folks are purposely bullying, sometimes when it's just really egregious behavior, you know that they're directing it to you. So you know that there might be something uncomfortable. I typically like to say, you know, because sometimes we allow our heads to get in the way, sometimes we allow our emotions to get in the way. So what I said is think with your head, listen to your heart, but trust your gut. If something in here feels like something's just not right, I typically go with it. And the sooner that we address issues, the better. Another thing that individuals can do is allow some time to pass before dealing with the issue or evaluating the situation. Because sometimes we might have been having a bad day, they might have been having a bad day. So take some time to sort of consider, say, okay, all right, let me take myself out of this for a moment. Let me allow some time to pass. Okay, let me think about what happened again. Oh, okay, well maybe it wasn't a big deal. Or, I'm still not comfortable with this. Let me circle back with the individual and have a conversation to see if there's something else. And then discuss any concerns with the individual directly or an uninterested party. And I always like to say, whenever possible, if you feel comfortable and safe, to have a face-to-face conversation. Because face-to-face conversations are a lot different than having a conversation over email. Folks can be really, really bold over email, right? You know, the internet allows folks to be really, really brave. But if we were standing and we were having a confrontation, you might not be as brave as saying it to my face. But obviously we don't want to have a confrontation. But what we do want to have is an opportunity to have a dialogue about what's going on, and hopefully we can move past it. I think, I won't say a lot of times, but sometimes what individuals will do is they'll allow things to build up, build up, build up, and then all of a sudden what happens, you've been dealing with that bully for a long time, and then all of a sudden what happens? Boosh! Explosion, and you're like, let me tell you, right? Because you've had enough, right? We don't want to get to that point, so we want to deal with it early so we don't get to that build-up. All right, so what are some of the challenges with working with a bully? And excuse me, I'm going to take this off. It's getting a little warm. I'm getting excited. It's a little warm in here also. So
That spicy chicken.
that spicy meal that I had just a moment ago. So what are some of the challenges with working with a bully? So unnecessary stress. Sometimes folks and their behaviors create unnecessary stress for us. The other one, you probably, if you've ever dealt with, if you've ever dealt with a bully, defense mechanisms are always on heightened alert. So if you know that someone is a habitual bully and you know that you have issues with an individual, what happens when they come into your space or your area, or you know that you need to have a conversation? Rigid, right? I don't want to deal with you. So you're automatically on defense. And even if on that particular occasion, they're not bullying you, guess what you're thinking? They're bullying me, right? Because you've dealt with it so long. Uncomfortable work environment. That's a horrible place to be when you're at work. We spend the majority of our time at work, right? So we spend more time at work than we probably do with our family. So we want to make sure that we have a safe environment. Companies have a responsibility to make sure that folks do not feel uncomfortable in their work environment. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then resources try to appease the bully to prevent any attacks. So in order to not have any verbal, mental, or emotional attacks, what do we try to do? We try to become friends with the potential enemy sometimes so that we don't receive any attack. So sometimes we might do things that we normally wouldn't do because we figure what? It's easier to do it than to deal with the bully. And then decisions always need to be validated against the bully's viewpoint. So if I make a decision, and imagine if you're working on a project and the bully is the project sponsor. So they have a lot of weight because it's their particular project, but you're running the project. And so you have a certain level of authority because you're running the project, because that's why they put you in charge. Because as project managers, program managers, we have oversight of the project. It is our responsibility to make sure that we successfully shepherd the project along to successful delivery. But if I always have to go back and validate every decision that I make with the bully, and the bully is using their power because they're the sponsor, well, that might be what you're thinking as a project manager, and your team might have agreed, but I'm the sponsor and this is the way that we're going to do it. So what do? Okay, you're the sponsor. I guess I'm going to do it that way. Or you might try to fight back against the sponsor. But a lot of times, when the sponsor controls the money, controls the budget, you sort of have to do what they say. But we know what eventually happens because they've used their power, which is not always based on their knowledge. What happens is we're forced to go in a certain direction, and we know this is not going to have a good ending, and then we go in that certain direction, and then you get to the point, and then stuff starts to fall on the ground, and then the sponsor's like, well, why did that happen? Well, didn't you? So those are some of the things that we have to deal with as well, because sometimes our decisions that we're making, we have to validate it against the bully's thoughts. And then the worst thing to have happen in any environment is to have an atmosphere of fear, because that could be very detrimental to the organization. The organization isn't as productive as it could be. Individuals aren't as productive as they could be, because if individuals are operating in an environment of fear, then they're thinking and rethinking and thinking and rethinking the things that they're doing instead of just acting and doing what they need to do. Quick story. Once upon a time I had a manager who said to me days after I started working for him, he said, let me just tell you this, there is nothing that you can do that I can't clean up. Think about that. There's nothing that you can do that I can't clean up. What does that message say to you?
It's a challenge.
Is it? Well, not necessarily the direction I was heading in. But what does it say? It says that the manager has a certain level of trust in your abilities to go out and do what you need to do. And if you make a mistake, if there are issues, it's okay. We will figure out how to get through it together. That's an important management mentality, to allow folks to go out and stumble and have mistakes and learn from it, versus saying, you better not make any more mistakes on this project. What's probably going to happen? At some point you're going to make a mistake because you're overthinking and worrying about the potential penalties associated with a potential misstep. So impact bullying can have on successful project delivery. So sometimes, as we've just sort of discussed, the outcome is influenced by the bully instead of the project and or the team. And so that can be very detrimental. I've worked on a lot of projects where I was the project manager or the program manager. We made a decision as the team, but the sponsor overrode the decisions that we made, and so, or challenged it or presented it in a way that better met their needs and objectives. So that can be a big issue. Additional work is required, and the reason that I underline this word is to try. Because we're dealing with bullies, it can be very, very difficult. So it's all about trying to appease the bully instead of the project goals and or objectives. Because as a project manager or individuals that are working on the project, what should be our ultimate responsibility? Our ultimate perspective should be to achieve the vision of the project, but to meet the goals and the objectives. And specifically the objectives, because those are the things that are measurable, that says we achieved the things that we set out to do as we were delivering the project. Project schedules are created based on the bully's direction instead of project considerations. How many of you have ever put together a schedule? Your team has worked together, there was great collaboration, you put the schedule together, and then you go into the sponsor's office, an executive manager's office, and they said, no, this can't be right. It can't possibly take you 10 days. It's going to be 3 days. Or you have a month worth of work here, and you've got to figure out how to get that down to 7 days or 5 days. And then what happens then? We put together schedules that are based on someone's unvalidated information because it's what they want and they have the power to influence it. And then guess who ends up cleaning it up on the back end? Us, as project managers. And then there's always a ripple effect. Because all the time that we were spending instead of working the project in a logical order, in a logical fashion, what are we doing? We're trying to meet the needs, the unrealistic needs of the project sponsors or other individuals. So we're doing all this busy work to meet an unrealistic schedule. Then we get to a point and then we realize I sort of told you that this was an unrealistic schedule, and now what are we doing? A bunch of busy work to clean up all the stuff that we weren't doing in the first place, and now we got to get ready to move forward to get things back on track, and then we go back and we re-level set the baseline for the schedule again. And typically, once you've had a misstep, in a reasonable organization, your managers will say, okay, we sort of rushed the schedule before, we had some unnecessary influences. You're the project manager, I'm going to allow you to move forward. Hopefully that happens, since it didn't happen the first time. But sometimes, we have these organizations, we have a bad schedule the first time, and then we didn't learn from our mistakes, and then we go through the same fire drill again, and then it turns out later that we missed deliverables again because we didn't go through the process. A lot of organizations will say, we have a lot of processes and methodology to deliver things, but then sometimes when push comes to shove and executives want to make certain deadlines or they've made certain commitments, unfortunately some of the processes and procedures get thrown out the window in order to meet their political or other goals. Honest information about the project issues and risk are not fully disclosed. So if you're dealing with a bully all the time on your project, what is it that you don't want to deal with? You don't want to deal with their attacks, their questions, their criticisms, or anything else. So what happens is, you might provide information, but you might not provide the full information because you don't want to feel the impact of their backlash. And that's a very bad place to be, because in organizations, when we're developing projects, what we want to do is make sure that our team, especially the project leaders, are providing open, honest, timely information. And if you create an environment that is uncomfortable, then what happens is we have other issues that are impacted throughout the project life cycle. And then the last one, again, deals with fear. Because if you are in an environment of fear, you're restricted in what you do and what you achieve. So what are bullies' impact on project deliverables? So when we think about our project deliverables, our schedules. So if we have a bully that's pushing us to create an unrealistic schedule, we have an overly aggressive schedule. So what happens is we create a schedule that's unrealistic. And then we create that schedule that's unrealistic. What happens? We can't meet it, and then it has other impacts. The project team has to work harder than necessary to meet the unrealistic schedule, things that I've already described. And then costs are estimated to be less than actual. That can't possibly cost that much to develop. Go back and look at it again and get the cost down. And then we start cutting corners because we're trying to meet somebody's arbitrary cost estimates. And then what happens is we get to a point where like, oops, it didn't work. Now we got to spend more money to not only fix the solution, but then what? Spend the money to get the solution that we needed to in the first place. And then resources are underestimated, which impacts the overall team's ability to get work done. So we've got to make sure that in our organizations that we're being open and honest in our communication, and the executives have to understand that project managers are in the role for a reason. And if they're not qualified to do their jobs, then you remove them and get someone else. But you also have to allow them to do their jobs. Yes, there's an executive direction that needs to come, but that executive direction should be in consultation with the project leader to make sure that you're achieving all the goals of the schedule, the cost, and the resources. So let's talk about bullies' impact on their victims, because bullies do have an impact on their victims as well. So absenteeism, folks don't come to work. You know, death's on the extreme, but sometimes folks do have heart attacks because they're so stressed out, which falls into stress, and it also sort of falls into the suicide. So let's get those out of the way quickly so we can move on. Some of the ones that aren't as bad, dissatisfaction, employee dissatisfaction. If you're being bullied at work all the time, are you going to be a happy employee? Probably not. Insomnia. How many of you have lost sleep over something that happened at work? Come on, be honest. And then lost employee. The employee leaves the organization because they just don't want to tolerate it. And that's actually one of the biggest issues right there. Lost employees related to workplace bullying. Because not everybody likes to deal with confrontations, and sometimes you deal with a confrontation, and then what happens? You get more aggressive behavior because you spoke up about it, and then instead of dealing with a situation, especially if you're reporting to senior executives within the organization, you know, folks are quick to say, go to HR and report it, HR will work with you to get this resolved. Well, HR is only there for the time that you've reported that issue, and hopefully they're going to correct it. But what happens is you still have to work in that organization. And whether it's related to what you reported or had concerns about, what could happen is they can make your life miserable in other areas. So we've got to think about those things as well. Impact on morale, which sort of goes into the employee dissatisfaction, job loss, mental well-being. Imagine if you're being beaten up all the time, every day at work. You know, it can have an emotional and physical impact on your well-being. Productivity efficiency. If I'm worrying all the time about what somebody's going to say about the work that I'm doing, what am I not worrying about? The work that I'm doing. And I can't be the best that I can be. Self-worth. If you're being attacked for the things that you're doing all the time, it can have an impact on your self-worth. You know, one of the things that I was taught early in my career was, someone said to me, you need to develop thick skin. Didn't give me any additional information, but you need to develop thick skin. Would have been nice if they had a little follow-up to that. It took me years to learn what thick skin is. And why it's important. And in all of my college classes, and I actually teach in the jails also, what I will teach them is about the importance of thick skin. You know, because sometimes folks will say something to intentionally hurt you. Because if they know that they can get your goat, and if we let them know that they're getting our goat, then sometimes they get that fun and enjoyment out of it. Sickness ties into absenteeism, but sometimes we can get physically sick. Has anyone ever had a job that you were physically sick every time you went to work? Never? Okay, I had a job early in my career. I hated it. It was a busboy at a restaurant. I was young. I needed some money. But it was interesting. Towards the end of my days when I worked there, I would have a headache every time I got to work. And I was like, that's interesting. And then I realized I needed to start taking some aspirin with me. And then I said, hold on. I only get this headache when I come to work. I said, maybe there's a connection here. And it turned out that there was. Transference. How many of you have ever taken something, I mean, you probably won't admit this freely, but taken some stress from work and taken it home? Has that ever happened? Yeah, probably. You don't have to admit it here. And then weight loss gain. And depending on which side of the equation, it could be a good thing for you. All right. So bullying underreported. So why is bullying underreported? One of the biggest reasons that bullying is underreported is culture. There is an acceptable behavior within the organization that folks say this is okay to do it. Everything starts with culture. It starts with the executives within the organization, because the executives set the culture that everybody else follows. So if the executives are bullies, if the executives treat folks less than they should be treated, less than their worth, I always like to say, then others in the organization will say, well, that executive is talking to folks that way and it's acceptable behavior. It's okay for me, 2 levels down, to treat my employees the exact same way, or to treat my coworkers that way also. But unfortunately, also in organizations, and I've seen this way too many times, there are folks that are bullies within the organization, but they get results, and because they get results, they're well respected, they have a lot of information, they're doing what? Right? They don't acknowledge it, because we don't want to lose this talent in the organization, even though they're creating a lot of chaos for others within the organization and on the project teams. So this is just something to think about. Job loss, because if folks leave, they're like, you know what, I'm just not going to deal with it. I leave. And they never say anything. Well, they say, well, there's a high turnover. Maybe they just weren't set up for the job. Not everybody's going to say, that manager was abusive, even as they're walking out of the door. Because what do folks want? They want to get a good recommendation later. So that could be a powerful motivator not to say anything. Perception. Perception can be very powerful in organizations. If you are perceived as being a complainer, that you're a tattletale, that can impact your ability to manage projects, to get additional work, get promotions, get pay raises. It can have a lot of different impacts. Process. Sometimes, as I started off in the presentation, there aren't documented processes, or individuals don't know how to go through the process, Or even worse, if the process will work for me if I go through it. Is it worth me taking the risk to report bullying behavior for a manager that I report to that has control over my promotion, my pay raises, and everything else? Is it worth my time, energy, and effort to report it? And oftentimes, unfortunately, folks say no. Retaliation, which sort of falls into that. And then lack of clarity about rights. So typically organizations every year talk about ethics. I'm sure each of you has probably gone through an annual exercise, which I just call it a little checkbox exercise, because typically you have to fill, sign a form, do a computer simulation, the same one that you did the year before, and it's just sort of a checkbox exercise, right? But there aren't any real discussions like, here was an unethical event that occurred in this organization, this is what damage it caused, this is what the outcome was, and if you do this, this is what will happen to you. You don't have to say who it is, but a lot of times we know who it is, even if you don't tell, because there's a great grapevine at work, right? But we want to make sure that folks understand what their rights are. So I would suggest that organizations talk about workplace bullying often, because not everybody even knows that this is what it is. Some folks just believe this is just a management style and it's okay. So make sure that individuals know about what is acceptable and not acceptable behavior, and what processes are in place so that individuals can resolve any workplace issues. And sometimes there needs to be the availability of someone that's outside of that chain of control that individuals could say, you know what, something's happening in this organization, here's my manager, I don't want to talk to anybody in my chain of control because I'm not comfortable with that, but if you can give me a manager in an organization that's not related, that can be sort of the liaison between the individual that's affected and the management team, and then working with HR, in concert with HR. So what's company responsibility? So companies should demonstrate respect and fair treatment for all resources. Companies set the tone for acceptable behavior. It starts with the executives, and it's also driven down through the organization through policies, procedures, and practices. Create behavioral policies and standards related to appropriate conduct. You've got to let folks know what your expectations are by telling them, by demonstrating it, bless you, and if there's an issue, resolving it timely. Enforce any policies or standards timely, fairly, and without retaliation. If I have an issue that's occurring to me at work, I should feel comfortable that I can go ahead and report it, and there won't be any type of backlash or retaliation because I raised my hand and said, I don't feel that I'm being treated fairly or being treated respectfully. There should not be an issue with doing that. As I talked about earlier, having opportunity to review what the expectations are related to not just ethics, but just acceptable standards of behavior, at least twice a year. Once a year is great, but twice a year is better. Ongoing conversations is even better yet. And then review your policies and standards annually to determine if any updates are required. Because having policies and procedures are great, but we should go through a process of reviewing our policies and procedures periodically to make sure that they meet our needs. And if they don't, then we need to update the policies and procedures. Because it's easy to write policies and procedures in advance of something happening, but once something happens, we need to validate, did our process work? So if someone said that they had an incident with being bullied and they went through the process, did the process work correctly for those who investigated, and also for those that are being harassed, and also those that are being investigated for bullying behavior? So it's a complete evaluation of the processes and procedures. Individual responsibility. As we discussed earlier, it starts with the individual. The individual has the most responsibility to make sure that they're not being treated in a way that they consider inappropriate. So you got to become familiar with the types of bullying behavior. And there's a whole lot of bullying behavior, and we looked at a partial list of them earlier. You also need to make sure that you understand what the company's policies and procedures are. A good time to become familiar with the policies and procedures are typically before something happens, not just when you need it. Because if you don't know what the policies and procedures are, you don't necessarily know that you can use them or leverage them to resolve your issues unless you get backed into the corner. And when we get backed into the corner, sometimes it might be a little bit too late. Make sure that you communicate with the bully that this is not acceptable behavior. This is not something that I am going to tolerate. You cannot treat me in this way. And sometimes what will happen is individuals will say, you know what, I didn't realize that that was bothering you. But if we don't have that initial conversation with them, then they don't know. But sometimes when bullies are just bullies, they're just hardened bullies, it's not going to change anyway. So you need to have assistance from others in the organization. Keep a record of any bullying incident with a copy kept in an offsite location. Documentation is everything, because if there's a pattern of events, you want to make sure, or pattern of behaviors, you want to make sure that it's documented, because when it's being investigated, there will be a lot of questions about what happened, when did it happen, where did it happen, who else was involved. So you need to make sure that you have documentation. But the reason that I also say that it should be kept at an off-site location as well, because if something happens that you leave the organization or you have it in their computer files, they have access to that information, and hopefully they wouldn't manipulate it, but you want to make sure that you have a secondary copy of the information that's available. And then make sure that you report any bullying incidents to management and human resources as soon as possible, because that's what management's job is. Management's job is not just to make sure that work is done properly within the organization. Management's job is also to protect their employees, to make sure that the employees are treated fairly, and that they also are developed in an environment that is conducive to positive work behaviors. So, bullies aren't always intentionally bad. Some of them are, but all of them aren't. So sometimes a bully just doesn't understand that their behavior is bad, and that's why we need to let them know that your behavior is not acceptable, because if we don't communicate it, they won't know. Sometimes, and I think some of you might have mentioned back there earlier, is that the bully emulates the behavior of another bully. They see bullying going on in another organization, another individual that they respect, and they say, that's the way to manage. That's the way to get things done. The bully is under unknown pressure, inside or outside of work. So when we leave our homes and we come to work, we don't leave the pressures of home behind. We bring that with us. We may try to check it at the door, but sometimes it comes out in ways that we don't expect because we have such stresses. So it could be that there's something that's going on with that particular individual that you just don't know anything about, and it isn't a pattern of behavior, it was an incident, and then you say, hey, you know what, Jill, that wasn't a good day, wasn't a good experience. And then Jill might say, you know what, I understand it, I apologize. Or Jill might say, you know what, I understand that, I apologize, here's what's going on. And then you have a better understanding, because sometimes a perception of bullying behavior is actually sometimes a misunderstanding, and it gives us an opportunity to clear things up. The bully believes that abusive behavior is leadership. Abusive behavior isn't needed for leadership. I do not need to abuse, demean, threaten, harass, name call, or anything else in order to get workers to do the things that they need to do. I can get folks to do what they need to do by showing that I care about their efforts, that I support them, and that I set acceptable behavioral guidelines and expectations for them to meet, and then we collaborate in a collaborative manner, we work together to get things done. And then the bully believes that threats and or intimidation will improve or drive results. You know what? It might work initially, but it doesn't work long time. If you want someone to do something and you hit them on the head that first time, they might say, okay, oh, I'm alert now, I guess I should pay attention. But if you're constantly, boom, every time you do something, guess what? It doesn't have the same effect the more that it happens. But guess what? I anticipate that it's going to happen, and then I say, you know what? If I'm going to get beat up for the things that I do right, I'm going to get beat up for the things I do wrong. Why should I work so hard to do any of these things anyway? So just some things to think about. So how do we help the workplace bully? Well, we help the workplace bullies by counseling, letting them know that this is not acceptable behavior. Sometimes they just don't know. Mentoring. Mentoring is a great training opportunity because we can put someone who's bullying with someone who's a respected resource in the organization that doesn't bully and is an effective leader without being manipulative or anything else, and say, we want you to spend some time with this individual so that you can learn acceptable standards of behavior that are respected in this organization where individuals are treated with a level of dignity and respect. Training. Maybe they were never trained. Maybe they need some more training. So that might be an opportunity. And then at the end of the list, if we can't resolve the issue with counseling, mentoring, or training because it just doesn't work, or the individual just doesn't want to change, then at that point we need to think about separating the individual from the organization. So in summary, we need to understand the bullying types and the strategies to deal with bullying. That's where it starts. If you understand what bullying behavior is, it's a great place to identify what strategies you need to use in order to resolve the issues. You can't deal with every bully the same. Some bullies, you can be very, very firm and you'll get your message across. Some bullies, you just got to be a little bit nicer to for them to listen to so that they don't feel threatened to you. So you need to sort of size up the individual and figure out what works and what doesn't work. Address any unwanted or concerning behavior as soon as possible to prevent future attacks. The quicker that you resolve an issue or identify that there's an issue, address the issue, there's a quicker opportunity to resolve it. Document any of your concerns. Discuss the concerns with a trusted individual. I have found throughout my career when I've managed projects, when I've dealt with difficult individuals or bullies that were sponsors or executives within the organization, it was very useful for me to go speak with someone, sometimes within the project team or the organization that I'm working with. A lot of times it was better to go have a conversation with someone that's not even connected with it, so they don't have an understanding about any of the players that are involved, and they can give you an unbiased feedback and guidance in terms of how you can handle that particular situation. And sometimes it's good to just have a third person involved with the conversation, because if I'm having a conversation with you and I'm telling you you're a bully and you're saying I'm not a bully, not necessarily are we going to be listening to each other. So sometimes it's nice to have someone that can mediate the conversation to help you resolve it. And then we want to seek guidance from trusted and respected internal resources, because someone that has guidance about how the organization works, the culture, the processes, the procedure is great. But I also would add, even though I don't have it on the slide, outside the organization as well, because there's a lot of great resources that are available outside the organization as well to deal with any type of bullying behavior. So my parting thoughts for you are, no one should have to deal with or tolerate abusive, demeaning, condescending, or any other type of unwanted behavior. It's just not necessary to get work done. And then also, if an organization doesn't protect its resources from unnecessary abuse, individuals must take actions to protect themselves, because ultimately it's an individual's responsibility to let others know that their behavior is not acceptable. And then my contact information, if you're interested in following up on some of my other stuff. I have my websites, my published works, and then Facebook and Twitter if you want to keep in contact with me. And that's the end of the formal presentation. Questions on anything?
Yeah.
Okay.
Earlier in your presentation,
can you speak up just a little bit for me?
Sorry. Earlier in your presentation, you touched on a sponsor potentially being a bully, or a program manager being a bully. I'm curious to know, or see what your feedback is in the scenarios where, one, the PM is actually the bully, or the PM has a bully on their project team, and what if the prime contractor is a bully to the subcontractor?
There's a lot of questions in there. I thought there was one question. All right, so let's sort of break it down. So what happens if was one of them the sponsor? And I know one was the PM, or someone on the project team,
yes.
And then one is the main contractor.
Yeah, because primes do bully the subs.
Right, the primes, yeah. So if the PM is the bully in the organization, I like to address things head on, so I would have a conversation with the PM initially, to say, I just have some challenge in the way that you're communicating with me or the direction that you're providing, and then to see if I can have that initial conversation. And then if that doesn't work, then I would utilize the next level of management. So I first would probably go to my manager to seek some guidance and say, you know what, I had a conversation with the PM, this is here are the specific things that are happening and how I feel about it, and then see if we could potentially have a meeting with my manager, because again, using the model where there's somebody who can sort of be an intermediary. And then if that doesn't work, I think my next step, well, I don't think I know, my next step would be to include the other manager's manager involved in the conversation, because at that point it's an issue for that manager, because my manager can't necessarily direct behavior of the PM, but their manager can get involved with the situation, okay? And then you had just you had asked about what if you have someone that's on your project team, not necessarily a project sponsor, but just an individual that's on the project team. I've seen that more times than any other incidents as it relates to bullying, because individuals can be very passionate, and sometimes passionate comes off a little bit wrong or whatever other reasons. What I like to do as the project manager is I typically won't have any confrontations in my project meeting, but what I do is I make a note. And I won't go to the individual immediately, so let's just say it just happened in a project meeting, or if there's a pattern or behavior. I won't address it in front of the project team, because I always believe in pip-pip, praise in public, punish in private. So I would schedule a follow-up meeting before the next public meeting for us to get together. And what I would also suggest in this particular situation is seeing if you can separate yourself away from the work environment. So go get a cup of coffee, go grab some lunch or something like that. So you could sort of remove yourself from the environment to have a private conversation. And if they're not willing to sort of go have coffee or lunch or something, see if you can get a private meeting space to have a conversation. Now the other one's a little bit trickier, because if you are under the umbrella of a private contractor, they have a lot of power and pull within the organization. Hopefully there are documented mechanisms in place for resolving any types of potential conflict. So it depends on who you are with the contract, unfortunately, because if you're a really small vendor and this is your bread and butter, you might not want to address it, even though it's appropriate to address the behavior. You might not want to address it because they can cut you off or find some reason to disconnect you from the project. But I always say fear should not be a reason for individuals not to address an issue, because you can always address the issue and then sort of size up what's going on and then figure out what your next steps could potentially be after that point. But when you have a contractor that has a lot of power over your financial interest, and you have to tread, the reality is you have to tread a little bit more lightly, but I do not submit that you should not address the issue, because it's not fair that the issue is not being addressed, but more importantly, it's not fair to you, because if you don't address any of the individuals, any of the scenarios that you offer to me, then you're the one that's going to be dealing with it. They're not going to be suffering from it. So why should you suffer for something that bothers you if you don't even take a step to try to resolve it in the first place? Ma'am?
Hi, Stacey.
Hi. I feel like at a disadvantage. What's your name?
Sandy.
Hi, Sandy.
This was a great presentation, and it some definite thought-provoking information. And you sort of alluded to the fact that there are more solid, if you will, more defined guidelines for harassment, EEO kinds of issues. In your experience so far, are you seeing any movement toward there being, maybe not so far as a law, but things that you believe at some point there will be more defined guidelines on workplace bullying? Because we certainly hear enough about it with schools and college kids and things like that. I was wondering if you're seeing any move toward that.
That's a great question. It's actually something that I should have included in my presentation, because there's been movement to try to enact laws for a long time in the United States, and there haven't been any laws that have been actually enacted, because a lot of times the argument is if we add an additional law to protect individuals from workplace bullying, it's going to open up the floodgates for lawsuits. But the same argument was made in reference to sexual harassment. So that really isn't a strong argument. So what we're saying is it's okay to allow folks to be put into a situation that they are being abused and not have a remedy for action. So that's what we're saying if we don't want to change the law. And some of my friends have said to me, because I've become an advocate for workplace bullying, they'll say, well, we don't need another law. I said, well, yes, we do, because no one should not have a remedy to resolve any issue that they have. And laws can be powerful motivators for companies to make sure that they have their policies in check. So the other piece that I'd like to touch on, actually there's probably two. There is movement, and if I can remember correctly, so don't quote me, I believe in New Jersey and Massachusetts, There were some active bills at least a couple of weeks ago that were moving towards potential approval, and they would be the first bills that would be enacted in the United States. I don't know the current status of them right now, but they were the first bills that were actually making some positive progress towards being enacted. So we sort of cross our fingers and wait and see what happens. The other piece that you were talking about, because there was a lot to your questions, even though it was a simple, but there's a lot of pieces to it. The other portion is related to EEOC. So what a lot of individuals don't realize or understand is that bullying, discrimination, and things of that nature are legal in a lot of cases unless you are part of a protected class. If you're part of a protected class, then there's remedies related to the EEOC. So in my book, I write about a particular gentleman who was working at a car dealership, and he wore a tie to work to support his team, but it wasn't the tie that was a favor for this particular dealership. So his manager said, take the tie off. He said no. The manager said, take the tie off. He said no. And he probably was told a couple more times to take the tie off. He said no. Guess what happened to him? He was terminated. And he didn't have any remedies. So in a lot of cases, individuals can be terminated for a lot of things. So let's think about states like Virginia. And this is another issue with the way the laws are set up right now. Virginia is an at-will state. So anybody can be fired at any time for any reason, with or without cause. Typically organizations won't do that. They'll follow their process and procedures to minimize the likelihood of a lawsuit. But when you have rules that allow anybody, if I could come in today and say, I'm sorry, is that a maroon sweater you're wearing back there? Is that maroon? Oh, it's maroon? I'm sorry, you're out of here. I could legally do that. It's probably not going to happen that way, but I never thought that guy would have been fired because of a tie. So these things happen.
Well, I have to share this real quick story.
Sure.
When I first saw the title of this, I thought, geez, have I ever known anybody who was a workplace bully? And then I remembered one customer, government customer, who was a very senior civilian. And it was funny because a lot of the things you said in here, he had all the signs and symptoms of being a bully. Mm-hmm. And I always hated going to brief this guy because he was just so, it was almost like passive aggressive, like
one of the types that I described earlier. I had on the list.
You pay us to be here. We're the ones who are supposed to be giving you this information. But the funny part of the story is eventually he retired from the government, and a few months later he came back into the organization and he's in his suit and tie. And I asked one of the government people in the office, I said, wow, what's Mr. So-and-so doing back here? And they said, well, I think he came back, he wanted to talk to some of the other senior guys about his new company that he stood up. I was like, oh, what's he doing? He's an executive coach.
There's no irony in that, right?
Oh, God help us. If the one that's going to be coaching people on how to act.
Yeah, interesting. Question?
Isn't some of the bullying in the workplace, would that be covered under a hostile environment?
A hostile work environment? Yes and no. It depends on the level of severity, because in certain cases, in order for it to be a hostile work environment, it has to be really, really egregious in most cases, and it has to be a pattern of behavior. So you might be able to file a complaint against EEOC. It's a lot easier to file that particular complaint, but a hostile work environment, it has to be something that's really, really devastating to an individual. So a lot of times individuals won't necessarily go after the hostile work environment, but they'll say that it's something against a protected class. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much for your time. And but before we stop, do you have some tickets?
Yeah.
We're going to give you some tickets, and here's a copy of my book, Bullies. They're in your office too. Could you be one? And in this particular book, what I've done is, in the front part, I think it's chapter 3 or somewhere around there, I describe all the different types of bullies. I also have a listing of what's the difference between a bully, a bad manager, and bad management. But the way that I laid out this book is these are actual case studies. I'm a professor, so I had to do case studies. So they're case studies based on actual events. So I describe the situation, I provide some critical thinking questions for you to think about, and then after each case, I provide a lessons learned. So I give you some lessons learned. So I don't tell you what to think about, but I give you some, I don't tell you what to do, but I tell you some things that you should think about. And then on the back end of the book, what I provide is what employees should do, what should companies should do, some statistics, and some of my parting thoughts about workplace bullying. And the other thing that I'll direct you to is on my website at www.slyoung.com. On my blog, I have written a few articles relative to workplace bullying, and I also have maybe a video, I think one video, maybe two. One video about workplace bullying and maybe one video about the book. So there's a lot of references on my website as well. All right, does everybody have a ticket? And maybe we can grab one of these glasses here and throw all the extras in here. And then before I kill myself. And then we'll do a drawing.
We also have tickets here we want to sell for the raffle. The raffles are going for, we can do it anyway.
All right.
Mix them up. We should do it. Okay.
All right, we'll do a little. Do you have a ticket in here too? Did you, okay. Oh, that's right. I got one for you. I'm sorry. I forgot. All right. Pick one, please. I want to make it a fair drawing. He grabs the one that's right on top. All right. 6, 2, 1, 3, 5, 0. All right. So there's one copy. And if you want, I can sign it for you later. If you're interested, you're welcome. And I actually have one more, so we'll do one more. Can we reach down in there this time? All right, hold on. Let me put that one down first. Okay. 6, 2, 1.
I got that.
3, 5, 2. All right, back there in the corner. I think I got another copy here. Yep. All right, there you go.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
We'll have to wait for the room.
All right, well, thank you very much. Hopefully you found this informative, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me on my website. So thank you very much for having me.
So we have some for you too.
Oh, well, thank you.
Just a great big thank you for you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Greatly appreciate you coming out
thank
here.
you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed it very much. So thank you.
Just one final note, you can get one BDU for today. You self-report, Water Organization 6221. So when you self-report, you can put that in for Southern Maryland. You can use either myself or Terry as your point of contact.
I will email out your